Hello and welcome to Book by Book. My name's Steve Nichols and I'm so glad you've joined us today. Book by Book is Bible study that you can do on your own or as part of a small group, and it's all about meeting Jesus in the Scriptures. So you'll need a Bible. We're starting a brand new series today in the New Testament letter to the Romans. Augustine, the great African bishop of the 4th century, Martin Luther in the 16th century, and John Wesley in the 18th century, they were all changed forever by the letter to the Romans. It has literally changed the course of history. Now, you might feel intimidated by Romans, but don't be. It doesn't just belong to the big brains and the professors. The Apostle Paul wrote it to ordinary Christians like you and me, and we're going to meet some of them by name later in the letter. Romans unpacks the good news of Jesus so thoroughly that when you take it in, you'll never be the same again. And here to guide us through it are Lorna Wade, counsellor and senior pastor of Micah Community Church here in London, Dr. Paul Blackham, church planter, church minister and theologian, and Tobias Brown, senior pastor of Grace Community Church, Brockley. Well, let's dive straight in to Romans chapter 1. Pick up a Bible and let's turn to Romans chapter 1 and verse 1. Paul, a servant of Christ Jesus, called to be an apostle and set apart for the gospel of God, the gospel he promised beforehand through his prophets in the Holy Scriptures regarding his Son, who as to his human nature was a descendant of David, and who through the Spirit of holiness was declared with power to be the Son of God by his resurrection from the dead, Jesus Christ our Lord. And let's skip on to verse 14. Paul writes, I am obligated both to Greeks and non-Greeks, both to the wise and the foolish. That is why I'm so eager to preach the gospel also to you who are at Rome. I am not ashamed of the gospel, because it is the power of God for the salvation of everyone who believes, first for the Jew, then for the Gentile. For in the gospel, a righteousness from God is revealed, a righteousness that is by faith from first to last, just as it is written, the righteous will live by faith. Tobias, let me begin with you, if I may. Why do you love this letter of Romans so much?
Yeah, I mean, part of the appeal of this letter and why I love this letter so much is because in it, Paul explains how the gospel, the good news of Jesus Christ, is God's plan to restore and to redeem the cosmos and to bring everything to unity together in himself in and through the person of Jesus Christ. So what we see in the gospel is how Paul, he outlines for us like where things went wrong. But then he goes on to talk about how in and through the person of Jesus Christ, God is going to renew all things. He's going to restore and redeem lost Adam. And in the end, the cosmos, all of creation will be renewed. And we kind of see that in Romans chapter 8, which is kind of like the highlight of the book of Romans. So this book, the reason I love this book so much is because it's not only good news for the here and now, but it also points to a future hope for those who have been redeemed and who have put their faith in Jesus Christ as their Lord and Messiah.
It is the gospel on a cosmic scale, isn't it? You need
Absolutely.
to stretch the canvas very wide.
Absolutely.
And he does that in Romans. Paul does that in this letter to the
Yep.
Romans. Paul, what would you say is the key to this letter?
I think it's one of those books which I've got all these massive tomes on Romans, like volumes and volumes and volumes. And I think sometimes people have studied Romans and think, oh, it's like very academic. And certainly the books written on it sometimes are, with multi-volumes and debates. And quite often those books really are debating with each other, really, rather than actually the book. But I think what has helped me is realizing, like, the Apostle Paul, he's a church planter. And he's not some professor, like, producing his dissertation in a university or something like that. he's a church planter, and he's in the middle of trying to do some church planting, and he's heading from one place to another, and then he's really writing a letter because he's wanting a particular church to get into international church planting. And there's this church at Rome, and he's like, oh, if they got really into and got this vision that they could take the gospel anywhere in the world and plant churches, if they do that, that'll be amazing. Because he's thinking, oh, Roman Empire reach and things like that. And of course, that church did. And you think, well, the Roman church, it's like today, you might say, well, that's a complicated thing. Yeah, okay, it becomes complicated as history goes on, the Church of Rome. But that is how mega successful it was. So I feel the key to it is not, because people, as you said, people can be like, oh, it's too much for me, but Romans. No, don't read it like that. Read it as if this is a church planter who's saying, listen, you're going to get hit with lots of questions when you're doing church planting, like, why, what's gone wrong with the world? And is this fair that God saves bad people? And, it's the gospel. You can just sin all the time then if he just... All these sorts of questions. He actually deals with them all because he's really saying, just get out there. Get out there and start planting church. Go anywhere with this gospel. It'll work anywhere. And you've got answers to all the questions people will raise.
He's training us for mission and training the Romans for mission, isn't he, in this letter? Lorna, can I turn to you? Why should we just start reading the letter to Romans and maybe not be too intimidated by all these books that have been written about it, but why just start with this one, and how?
I think that Paul makes it quite simple. Having all this knowledge as a Jew himself, he had all this knowledge of the law, and now coming to Christ, it kind of all fit together, and he's able to explain to the Roman church and the Gentiles how the Old Testament and the New Testament somehow come together, and presents this beautiful picture of Christ, who from the Old Testament, the story from the prophets, we're talking about this Christ that would come. So I think Paul has a way of just presenting it and making it so simple and making it so plain that I think Christians ought to really get into this book. And as I was kind of studying for it, I was like, oh, wow, I was seeing so many new and fresh things that I think would benefit. I think it's really a foundation for Christians to have a real grasp of the book of Romans. I think it's imperative, really.
And when we come to some bit of the letter, maybe that we do struggle to understand, I mean, what would be the advice to sort of get bogged down in that, or maybe just keep going and come back to it later? And
yeah, I would say that, to just keep going and just pray that God would kind of reveal to you what he really wants you to see. Because I think in all that we read, it really is just pointing to Christ and this whole thing of what Christ did for us. And I think that the book of Romans really does show that for us.
That's great advice. Just keep your eyes fixed on Christ. Absolutely. Keep going. And you read it again and again, you discover stuff which you didn't understand the first time, don't you? So, and it's only about an hour to read, isn't it? So maybe before we meet again for our next study, we'll read it through. Tobias, can I turn to you? And if we move on to, verses 11 to 18, where Paul says, I'm not ashamed of the gospel. He starts in verse 13. He talks about his plan to come to the Romans. I planned many times to come and see you. Why does Paul mention his travel plans here? And does that give us a bit of a clue about the purpose of this letter?
I think so. I think it gives us one of the clues, or one of the many purposes of this letter. I mean, remember, Paul has never been to the church in Rome. But verse 8 kind of highlights for us that, man, he's hearing amazing things that God is doing in this church in Rome. And he wants to visit this church because he wants to use his gift, preaching and teaching, to build up the church. But also notice that he wants to visit them because he wants it to be reciprocal. He doesn't just want to go and impart spiritual gifts to them, but he wants to be built up himself, which is amazing when you think about this mighty apostle wanting to visit this church because he hears that God is doing some amazing things. And he himself wants to come and be encouraged. So, I think that this speaks to part of one of the reasons, or his plans, that he wants to travel to Rome. But as we continue to read, I think we'll probably discover there may be other purposes why Paul wants to visit Rome as well.
Yeah. That's great, Tobias. Paul, would you add anything?
Yeah, because I mean, I think he's got in mind, hasn't he, Spain?
Right, exactly.
Yeah. And I think he's like got, I want to do a mission in Spain, which I guess if you're way down the other end of the Mediterranean, it's like, oh, Spain? What are you going to go there for?
Yeah.
But Paul's like, nah, I'll tell you, I think we can go. I think we can push into Spain. And he's probably like right into, because he talks about that later, doesn't he? And he's going to go, hey, I'm going to go into Spain, but I want those Romans on board with this.
Yeah.
So he's kind of sharing, I guess, part of this international vision. He says, I'm going to do it. So I want you guys on board with it. Yeah.
That's great, Paul. Thank you. Thank you, Tobias. He says in verse 16, I am not ashamed of the gospel. Why isn't he? Paul, why isn't he ashamed of this gospel?
Oh, it's one of the best bits. And on my Bible, there's an unfortunate division between verses 17 and 18 because actually he gives 3 reasons and they're all connected together. And he says, look, I'm not ashamed of the gospel because it's the power of God to save anybody who trusts him. And then the next one in verse 17, because in the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed. And then there's actually a third one, which is doesn't sound as obvious, but it actually is, and we'll hopefully see that. Verse 18, because, there's actually a because at the beginning of verse 18, but it's not in my English version, but it is in the original. So he's like, because of the power of God, because of the righteousness God is revealed, and because the wrath of God is revealed. That's why I'm not ashamed of the gospel. And for him, he's super excited to explain the wrath of God. But those 3 things, and just if I can, just say something about the righteousness of God, because it's going to be huge in the book. God, this like justice of God. Because when people think about the justice of God, it's like, oh, that's bad news, the justice of God. Because justice means he's going to come and absolutely destroy us. And sometimes people in the past have thought, oh, that's what the righteousness of God is. God's our enemy, sort of, and he's out to get us. But actually, it's not that. And the righteousness... in the Bible, I'll just be super quick. The righteousness, if you study all the verses, it's got 3 elements to it. Righteousness of God means he has compassion on widows and orphans and people who are damaged by sin. So the first thing almost is, I want to help you. He's righteous, therefore he wants to help. And then secondly, it's that he wants to redeem us from doing bad things. So it's the victims of sin, the doers of sin. I want to redeem you from I don't want you to be sinners. And then only the third one, he says, now at the end of everything, there is vengeance. If you won't be redeemed, if you won't be rescued, you won't just, then there's vengeance. But it's wonderful that when Paul says the righteousness of God, it's like, oh, that's supposed to be like, brilliant. That means help's coming. The righteousness is from God. I noticed in your reading, the righteousness from God. It's a gift, and we'll, I guess, see that more as we go on.
Paul, that's so helpful, helping us unpack righteousness like that. Lorna, is there anything you would add to that about that question? What is righteousness? Why is it so important in this letter to the Romans?
Well, it reveals God's character, his character. And as Paul mentioned, the compassion, the love. I think it was in Psalm 103 where it says that he doesn't treat us as our sins deserve. And, whilst he's a righteous God and a just God, he's that compassionate God that, and that's why he sent his son to die for us while we were sinners. So, God's not looking to spoil our fun or to just come and, clobber us. He is really looking to redeem us and to rescue us from sin. And I think that really speaks about his righteousness and that God always does what is right.
That's so helpful.
He always does what's right. I love that expression.
We'll come back to this in future studies, I know. We need to move on, though, a little bit. So I'm looking now verses 19 to the end of the chapter, to verse 32, and we're reading about the wrath of God being revealed. Tobias, if I can ask you, how can it be good news to know that God is angry or upset with human beings?
Yeah, that's a really good question, especially when you look at how many times the gospel is mentioned in chapter 1. Paul mentions the gospel 6 times. Gospel in Greek is evangelion, which means good news. So Paul is establishing from the very outset that this message that he's talking about is good news. So to your point, how is the wrath of God good news? So I think what the picture Paul is painting for us here is a very bleak and troubling picture of man's relationship with God. And what Paul is essentially saying is that apart from a divine intervention, man's relationship with God is hopeless. It's irreconcilable. We are too obstinate. We are too self-centered. We're too self-focused to accept God's truth as the right truth and to conform our lives to that truth. So we shake our fist at God and we say, no, I don't want you part of my life. I don't want you telling me what to do. And the Bible calls that sin. And so once we begin to see and understand ourselves as sinners and how our sinful actions warrant God's judgment, then we begin to see God's solution as good news, because God just doesn't leave us in that state of rebellion and without acting. But the good news is saying that God did act. He acted in and through the person of his son, Jesus Christ. And so it's the proclamation of the gospel which shows us God's intentionality in providing forgiveness, in providing reconciliation, and in through his son, Jesus Christ. And that's good news. But in order to understand the good news, we have to understand the bad news, which is God's wrath being revealed.
And the fact that he tells us, the fact that the gospel reveals this God's wrath, it shows us that he cares.
Exactly.
Doesn't it? He wouldn't tell us if he didn't care.
Exactly.
You know, just to be forgotten would be the worst thing. But he actually announces that it matters.
Exactly.
Isn't it? And that diagnosis is good news to have a diagnosis, isn't it? And,
No, absolutely.
And to get the treatment, as you say.
Absolutely.
So that's
Absolutely.
helpful.
Yeah.
Paul, if I can turn to you in verses 19 and 20, Paul writes about creation revealing what can be known about God. Does creation really reveal all that can be known about God? And if so, why don't we see this? Why don't people see this?
Yeah. I mean, because it actually says what may be known about God, everything that can be known about God. And I think, like, when I remember years ago when I was like a teenager and I read this, I was always thinking, it probably just means like a few things about God. Like creation tells you there's some sort of God and that God is kind of powerful. But then as you go on, you think, well, Muslims think it says that. And, Hindus maybe think, there's some sort of God out there who's kind of powerful, or maybe lots of them and things like that. No, the creation can't be saying just rubbish things like that. When you read through the Bible has so much about what creation tells us about the living God of Father, Son, and Spirit, and the gospel and resurrection, death. Like Jesus goes, see this seed here? Like this seed is talking about me, and it's about my death and resurrection. And you can put a seed and make a little hole, make a grave for it, and bury the seed, and then it dies and resurrects. And he goes, that is telling you about me. And then there's loads of examples, or the trees when the wind blows, which is like the Spirit. And then the leaves like hit, and it's clapping their hands, and the scriptures go, look at that! Trees are clapping their hands in praise for the living God. So, and you go, but I can't see that. And then Paul's like, that's something about you. That's not about the creation is preaching Christ and the gospel and the living God. And I always like it in Isaiah 6, where there's those living creatures that are come. Because the Lord rolls up to Isaiah, boom, and the temple's shaking, and there's those cherubim. And they're like, the earth is filled with his glory. And we're like, I can't see that. And then Paul's like, why not? That's because you are, we are blind. We're messed up, and we're looking at the world and we're like, I can't see God. And the creation's like, why not? Why are you so alienated from God that you can't see God shouting at you in every detail of creation? Water, weather, sea, the sea with its waves, and the scripture's like, look at that. than anything. But we don't see it because we're blind. And Paul's, that's what chapter 1's partly explaining. Yeah. We've blinded ourselves and we're like, no, I can't see it. I don't see it. I can't see it. And maybe even I don't want to see it. And it's very, like maybe Paul's favorite chorus might be, Jesus is Lord, creation's voice proclaims it. Does that date me a bit? But that is one, isn't it? And it's like, yeah, creation's voice does proclaim that Jesus is Lord.
And that's why he ends verse 20, so that men are without excuse.
Yeah. Oh, it is. Yeah, because in a way, if the creation just was like, there's some kind of God who's powerful, and then you get to Judgment Day, and then there's Jesus, you'd be like, well, who's he? Yeah. What's he got to... You would have an excuse if creation was not really saying anything. But because creation reveals such wonders and deep gospel, and every time there's a seed, and the sun rises, there's the sun who's defeating the darkness and all these sort of things. So that on that day, we're like, we have no excuse. He was shouted at us all the time.
Yeah, I mean, it says it right here.
Yeah.
That people are without excuse. They will be without excuse. Yeah. And it's just incredible how when you see that, it's like, to your point, God has made it so abundantly clear. Yeah. But because we turned our hearts away from him, we've become futile in our thinking and our understanding to where we have blinders on now. Yeah. We can't see the glory of God in creation. Yeah. But it's there.
It's there.
It's there.
Yeah. Yeah, the heavens declare the glory of God.
It's a good one.
Yeah.
We'll come back to that when we're in Romans 10. Yeah. Brilliant. Lorna, if I can ask you, the same sins and troubles of Paul's time here in Romans chapter 1, they're just as important today. Why is it important for us to preach about sin as we share the gospel?
Sin, that's a word that people don't really like. People in our generation probably feel quite offended when we use the word sin. But sin is sin in any generation. And the gospel clearly tells us that we have a sin problem. And this sin problem is no different for us today. And I think that we need to preach, because the gospel tells us about sin. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish, but have eternal life. And that's talking about God being willing to deal with our sin problem. And therefore we should not be shy to say that sin is sin. As difficult as it may be in our generation, but the Bible, clearly tells us that sin will ultimately bring us destruction. So therefore, to me, it's a kindness for us to say. And when we talk about sin, it's not about pointing the finger. It's that, we are all sinners without Christ, aren't we? And we all need Christ. So therefore, I think that it's important that we preach about sin.
And in this, the one, he's thinking, if we've just thought about how the whole of creation is preaching Christ, and then he picks on the way that in our messed upness, we go against our design, the way we've been created. And he goes, look, kids don't respect their parents. And it's like, wow, that's so unnatural. How weird is that? And then he talks about our intimate relationships, and he's like, even they're getting messed up, and people are going against the way we were designed. And it's almost as if, how can people get so detached from creation and the way they were made, and to be like, I don't care if God's made me, I'm going to live my way, and I don't care what creation's saying, and I don't even care what my own body says. I'm going to live my way. And then he's like, and the sins that he lists, they're just the same. We look at our world and we're like, yeah, man, nothing's changed. Sin then, sin now. It always manifests in the same sorts of ways that are so destructive.
Yeah, it's idolatry, right? It's exchanging the truth of God and our worship for God for the created. And once we do that, then, it is going against nature. How God has created us and designed us to be. And when we do that, then that's when destructive happens. Because if God gives us over to our insatiable desires and appetites, then sin is just going to destroy everything, even our understanding of who God is.
Absolutely. There's a psalm that says, righteousness exalts a nation, but sin is a reproach to any man.
Yeah.
So even on an individual level, sin will eventually destroy us if it's not dealt with. And only Christ can deal with our sin problem.
Exactly.
Maybe that's the place to stop today. Lorna, Paul, Tobias, thank you so much. We've made a great start on this letter, and I can't wait to keep going. There's more in store, but thank you so much for our study together today.
Thanks for having me. Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, Steve.
We've talked about a lot today, but what's our key truth? I think it's this. The gospel shows us why we're in such a terrible mess, and it shows us that God is powerful enough to rescue any of us from this mess. Romans chapter 1, verse 17 was a time bomb that went off in Germany 500 years ago. A monk called Martin Luther had thought it was down to him to make himself right with God. He thought of God as an obsessive perfectionist who would destroy him if he stepped out of line. He later said, I was a good monk and I kept the rules of my order so strictly that I may say that if ever a monk got to heaven by his monkery, it was I. But secretly, he confessed later, he was angry with God. I didn't love, yes, I hated the righteous God, he said, who punishes sinners. God's righteousness, Luther thought, was God standing against him, and it terrified him. But while he was studying Romans chapter 1 and verse 17, God revealed to Luther that he got it all wrong. For in the gospel, a righteousness from God is revealed, a righteousness that is by faith from first to last, just as it is written, the righteous will live by faith. And it was like the light had been switched on. He said, there I began to understand that the righteousness of God is that by which the righteous lives by a gift of God, namely faith. And nothing was ever the same again. We simply put our trust in Jesus, the righteous one. He said, I felt like I'd been born again and had entered paradise itself through open gates. It's the difference between do and done, between what I try to do to make myself right with God and what God has done for me in Jesus at the cross. It's God's power of salvation for everyone who believes. And that's why we're not ashamed of it. Well, we'll pick it up again. Do join us. Until next time, God bless you and goodbye.